In fact, the terms that are contained in Section 111 and the manner in which the D.C. Circuit has interpreted those words contradict the EPA's position. So they're really asking for an expansive definition that's never been done before, when the Supreme Court has actually set a standard that proves that they actually have to have an explicit direction. So the rule will fail on that ground. But let's shift to another legal problem that maybe goes to some of the more fundamental issues that we'll debate throughout the night. And that is that this rule is not enforceable by EPA because the assumptions it made, these outside the fence assumptions about how the grid will operate, they are not things that EPA has the power to make. When it sets a standard, it must be able to enforce the assumptions that are built into it. And so you have a line of jurisprudence and a statute called the Federal Power Act. And in that area of the law, it has been held consistently that intrastate electric power systems are the purview of the state. And so I'll wrap up by saying this, that EPA can't just say states have flexibility. EPA has to be able to prove they can enforce the assumptions they've built in to the rule.
Michael, I can give you one more sentence.
I'm going to borrow from the metaphor that Professor Freeman's colleague Lawrence Tribe has said. If a robber approaches you and says your money or your life, it doesn't make that action legal because he says you can pay with cash credit.
Triple kill.
Long sentence, but your time is up. Thank you, Michael Nasser.
Killing spree.
In fairness, Jody Freeman, I'm going to need an extra 45 seconds because that's what I forgot. I'm going to give it to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, so let me introduce you, first of all. Our final debater against the motion, climate change, the EPA has gone overboard. Jody Freeman, the Archibald Cox Professor of Law at Harvard and founding director of the law school's Environmental Law and Policy Program. Ladies and gentlemen, Jody Freeman.
Good evening. Good evening. There are 4 reasons you should vote no against this proposition. First, the benefits of this policy vastly outweigh the costs. It's very simple. You can concede, for the moment, for sake of argument, it might cost something to transition to a cleaner energy economy. We'll spend some time in our dialogue
Jody,
tonight.
I just got a note that they need you for the podcast.
Oh, no one's ever said that.
Do you want to, do you need her to start over?
We close in on victory.
How about for momentum's sake, I say? Wherever you want. I'm happy to continue.
Continue.
Okay. As you know, I'm recounting the 4 reasons you should vote against the proposition, and the first is simply that the benefits of it, of the policy, outweigh the cost. And again, we will have an opportunity through the discussion to challenge some of the claims the other side is making about skyrocketing electricity costs and reliability, which we believe we can very clearly dispute.
Headshot.
But for the moment, concede the idea that it might cost something to transition to cleaner energy. And the question for you is whether it's worth it. The projection for this rule is that by 2030, the benefits will be around between $30 and $50 billion. And the cost, and that's annual. And the cost, $5 to $8 billion. So you can see there this gap, the clear gap between benefits and costs. And that gap will shrink. In other words, it will be more costly to deal with this problem of climate change the longer we wait. For that, you don't have to believe EPA. You don't have to believe us, Carl and me. You don't have to believe the environmentalists, because economists on both sides of the aisle, and in fact, former officials from Republican administrations like Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary in the George W. Bush administration, have said very clearly that it's economically risky to wait to deal with this problem, that it gets
Killing
more
spree.
expensive as time goes by.
Mega kill.
So the first reason to vote against the proposition is simply that the benefits overwhelm the cost of doing so. Second reason you should vote against it, Carl made in his discussion of the policy implications of the rule. That is that it matters. It's a meaningful policy that will actually help us make progress. Contrary to the other side's claim, as Chuck said, that this makes no difference, that it's meaningless and insignificant and therefore illegitimate and shouldn't be pursued, it's just not the case. In fact, power plants in this country produce a disproportionate share of carbon pollution. Up to 30% of the economy's pollution is measured in 2013, and according to the nonpartisan International Energy Agency, That's 6% of global emissions. That on its own makes it significant. But what's really careless about that argument is that it amounts to saying that we shouldn't do anything about anything if we can't do everything all at once. That just can't be right. You have to be able to make progress on a problem like this, a global problem, incrementally and cumulatively. And what's required, as Carl said, is that all the major economies of the world make commitments just like this one, to cut emissions from the sectors of their economy that produce the most emissions. The third reason you should vote against the proposition is that it combines smart regulation with technology innovation. The other side's presentation, and Chuck made this point, rests on the idea that you should choose between technology like carbon capture and sequestration and regulation on the other hand, and that you should choose against regulation because they imply it doesn't. But in fact, the best combination is the two of them. So historically, what's happened when we produce smart regulation that motivates or incentivizes technology, we get tremendous gains. The catalytic converter Chuck mentioned, it was invented in 1950, but it wasn't widely deployed and it didn't appear in its modern, cost-effective form until Clean Air Act regulation required the auto industry to reduce emissions from the tailpipes of cars and trucks. That gave wind to the sales of the catalytic converter. The same is true of the Clean Power Plan. What it does is incentivize new technology, clean energy, wind energy, solar energy.
Domination.
And sets the course of the future and says, this is the direction we're going in this sector. You can invest in those technologies, and it will stimulate carbon capture and sequestration. Just the way it stimulated catalytic converters.
Triple kill.
Just to be clear tonight, Carl and I are not
Multi-kill.
Certainly not anti-carbon capture and sequestration. We just think the two work well together. The fourth reason is really what I'll spend the bulk of my time on, even though I'll run out here in the opener. In discussion, it's the legal argument that Mike made. And very briefly, let me say this. While I deeply respect my colleague Larry Tribe, who said that this policy is akin to lighting the Constitution on fire, with all respect, it is absolutely not the case. There is no commandeering of the states or interference with their sovereignty or guns to the head, as Mike colorfully invoked, because the states have a complete opt-out from this policy. The states can say, no, not going to plan. The federal government, you can be left to develop and enforce these standards on your own. That deal, that bargain, that the federal government sets pollution standards and the states are given the opportunity to devise plans to implement them the way they see fit in their jurisdictions, is at the heart of pollution laws passed beginning in the 1970s. And for 50 years, the Supreme Court has upheld that scheme as perfectly constitutional and in no way commandeering or interfering with the states. There is no 10th Amendment violation. Second, there is no taking of private property, which you sometimes hear opponents say. Mike didn't mention it, but I was thinking he might. And if we get there, I'll make that argument to you too, simply because industry doesn't have a constitutional right that is absolute in perpetuity to continue to harm the public health just because they always have, on the claim that it's their property. The Supreme Court in 200 years has never held that to be the case. There is no taking of private property. And finally, and I'll take my extension from you if you're willing to grant it, and finally, the argument that EPA is somehow veering out of its lane here and doing energy policy and creating an unprecedented scheme beyond, as Mike said, the fence line, a discussion we'll get into in the dialogue. EPA has taken a flexible law, which Congress passed in 1970 and has amended subsequently, giving it broad discretion to set standards using the best system. And it has done that in a creative, in a cost-effective, and in a flexible way that gives the states many, many opportunities to meet the standards. For that reason, because it's a cost-effective, flexible, reasonable application of this law within its discretion, and because the benefits vastly outweigh the costs, you should vote no against this proposition.
Thank you, Jody Freeman. And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate, where our motion is climate change. The EPA has gone overboard. Now we move on to round two, and in round two, the debaters take questions from me and from you, our live audience, and they address one another directly as well. It is more free form. Our motion is this: climate change, the EPA has gone overboard. We have heard the team arguing for the motion, Charles McConnell and Michael Nasi, argue that, number one, they make clear that they are not climate change deniers, but they do say that the EPA's Clean Power Plan creates a false sense of security, that it is scientifically underwhelming that this